So happy to be here today. This is a topic that's really interesting to me as time goes by in my life. I want to make sure that I'm protecting my brain and doing everything that I can to stay healthy for a long time. And for the past 2 years, I've been working closely with a physician who has been doing research on Parkinson's. So I've been heavily involved with patient care for people who have Parkinson's. And while this isn't a talk specifically about Parkinson's, there are a lot of the things that I'll be talking about that are generalizable. So, Dr. Lori Mishley is the doctor I've been working with, and she has been doing a patient reported outcome study for more than 10 years on people with Parkinson's looking for positive deviance, meaning people who are doing the best. What are they eating? How are they living their lives? And so I'll be sharing some of that with you and also the ways in which it can be generalized to other types of brain conditions. So looking at dementia, looking at attention, mood disorders, it has a lot of application. Our goals then, we'll be talking about those dietary and lifestyle patterns. So we'll look at nutrients and foods and also talking about ways that you can incorporate them into your diet. So I love to collect recipes. And so there's a whole bunch of recipes and ideas that hopefully are appealing to you in this presentation. Let's start with lifestyle. Many of you might know that there are many lifestyle factors that are important for a healthy brain. And I work really heavily with nutrition, but I also encourage people to live a healthy lifestyle as well. And I find sometimes people are really, really focused on what they're eating. And it's equally important to think about how you're living your life. And so these are some of the factors. I'm going to be showing you a couple of slides that have these kind of check marks on them. You can think of it as a checklist. You can also think of it as toggle switches. That's something I often use when I'm talking to patients is, these are toggle switches. And so if you think about that in a spectrum of toggle switches of things that can be beneficial, where are your toggle switches? Where maybe 1 is not optimal and 10 is optimal. How do you move those throughout your day and throughout your life? And if you have a couple of them, that might be in a lower range. If most of them are in the upper range, you probably will be doing good. And in that way, you can sort of think of it in that spectrum. So you might not focus so much on one area. If that feels kind of difficult, you might switch and focus to a different toggle switch. And over time, move them up. So these are some of the lifestyle toggle switches. Sleep, very, very important. Staying active, so at least 150 minutes a week. Also seems to be better to do it not just 150 minutes once a week, but having it maybe 30 minutes a day or more. Staying social. So this looks like a very social environment, which is great. Stress resilience, and then avoiding pollution and chemicals. Let's start with sleep. Sleep is something that is a common problem that I see in clinic. And what's important to know about sleep is that when you sleep, especially deep sleep, you have these sort of waves that go through your brain that help to clear out different protein tangles and waste products. And so it helps to keep your brain healthy. And so if you're not sleeping well, this can have a negative impact on your brain. So it's one of the toggle switches. And so I do see a number of people who say, oh my gosh, I can't remember the last time I slept well. And then they feel really stressed about it. And so I say, okay, let's take a look. I'm not the sleep expert. So seeing a sleep expert would be recommended if you're having trouble sleeping. But let's really focus on some other toggle switches. And we're going to keep this one in mind. One of the tools and devices, so I'm a little bit of a data nerd. I like to collect data. And so I think a really great personal biometric device. I don't work for any of these companies that I am going to be talking about, but I think an Aura ring is a really great way to measure a lot of different biometrics. And I think it's a great sort of unintrusive way to measure your sleep. And it will give you, not only how many hours of deep sleep you're getting in REM sleep, but it also will measure how many hours your day you're in stress or in relaxed states. So I think it's a pretty interesting device. Anyway, if you're having trouble sleeping, I think it's worthwhile to try to move that toggle switch higher. Social connection is also really important. So, lots of research about this. The US Surgeon General actually has just declared loneliness an epidemic and a health crisis. So, um, I know that some people are not happy in some certain social situations, and so I would say just find social situations that make you happy, even if it's one on one. And it could also be things like learning a new language or a musical instrument. Anything that engages your brain is going to be helpful long term. This is from the patient-reported outcomes study that I was referring to earlier, and so it's looking at some of the modifiable lifestyle variables that impact Parkinson's. But if you look at other types of health conditions, whether it's anxiety and depression, whether you look at Alzheimer's or dementia, you're going to find very similar results here. And so, if we look at the bottom, um, the numbers are correlating to a survey that Dr. Mishley had developed, which um, positive points correlate to faster progression and negative points correlate to slower progression. And so hopefully you can see on the screen, but if we look at the bottom, I have a lot of stress and I am lonely, have pretty significant positive points, meaning correlated with progression. And then if we look at exercise, 6 to 7 days a week seems to be the most protective. Toxic exposures, there's quite a lot written about toxic exposures. And some of them we have control over, some of them maybe we don't have control over. I think there are a number of chemicals that we have in our environment that people are realizing more and more that some people are more sensitive to them and that there are certain environments where we might have greater exposures. But there's research that shows that there are certain chemicals that can be harmful to the brain. And I apologize, this is one of those, pictures from a study that could be thought of as like a ridiculogram with too much there, but I'm going to go ahead and just review what's here. So we see over here a person with spraying pesticides. Obviously, anyone who sprays pesticides, and that could even be that if you're spraying Roundup around your environment, it could be that you might spend time in environments where there's lots of pesticides, or even maybe having exposure through your diet. So there can be direct effects and indirect effects of some of these chemicals. And so the direct effects could be the effects that they have on the neurons themselves. Particularly with Parkinson's, this is an area that is important to consider. It can also have an effect on the microbiome. So this is the bacteria in our gut that really impacts how our bodies function in so many ways, from our immune system to our nervous system to our metabolic health. So many ways that a healthy microbiome or bacteria balance can influence that. And there are some pesticides that actually can damage some of the lactobacillus and bifidobacteria in the gut, and then can create a circumstance where there might be an imbalance that could cause inflammation. So inflammation will be a topic that we keep coming back to, because whether it's inflammation that comes from our environment or within our bodies, that can have a negative effect on the brain. And so if we're looking further at what's happening with the gut microbiome, this is a very common topic when we're looking at brain disorders, that some of the different proteins that originate in the gut can become more inflammatory, and that can actually, they can travel up the nervous system up to the brain. There's a strong connection between the brain and the gut, and we can end up having some of these folded proteins like alpha-synuclein for Parkinson's, or beta amyloid with Alzheimer's, or tau proteins, or all of these proteins that have been found in the brain that create these tangles that can cause degeneration in the brain. And so the point here is that if you can reduce your exposure as much as possible to chemicals, that's typically ideal for the brain. And a few years ago, I participated or helped develop a continuing education series for the Academy of Nutrition where we talked about environmental exposures. And I think it was probably a series that went through the most editing of any series I've ever participated in, because they wanted to be so careful to make sure we were evidence-based. And there were so many aspects of that where there were some aspects of it, I should say, where we fell back on something called a precautionary principle, which is a valid scientific principle where if there seems to be a probability that there could be harm, and there's no harm in taking an action that would prevent you from the exposure, why not? It's sort of we know that there's not benefits to having exposure to some of these chemicals. So the least that you can be exposed to them, the better. So how do we reduce our pesticide exposure? Buying organic or having organic or foods can be a great way to do that. Washing produce well, avoid spraying pesticides in your yard, using filtered water. And then there are some environments where pesticides are sprayed pretty heavily, and we might not have control over that. So some people might say, well, I don't know. I don't know if I can have control over a lot of these different exposures. And what I would say to that is we can support our organs of elimination. So when we get exposed to things, if we are well hydrated and if we're eating lots of plant-based foods that offer protection, we're going to actually be supporting our body in terms of protecting ourselves and getting rid of different things we might be exposed to. So we can just do our best. Remember, this is one toggle switch, going back to all of the different toggle switches we're going to be looking at. But there are some ways to identify what you might be exposed to. And if you want to sort of prioritize how you might buy produce, the Environmental Working Group is an organization out of Washington, D.C. that publishes data about different types of environmental exposures. You can go and look up the Dirty Dozen and the Clean 15. Some of you might have heard that before. So what are the foods with the highest and the lowest levels of pesticide residue? So the ones that have the highest are strawberries and spinach, kale, collard greens, mustard greens, peaches, pears, nectarines, a lot of fruits, grapes, bell peppers, cherries, blueberries, and green beans are some of the top. So if you were going to buy organic, then those would be good ones to look for. You can also go to farmers markets, and there are a lot of small farms where they don't spray. So, there definitely are options. If you have, I don't know if you have an option if you have a pea patch or a way to grow anything here, but that is another way to get around that, the pesticide exposure. And then the Clean 15, we have avocados, sweet corn, pineapples, onions, papayas, sweet peas, asparagus, honeydew, kiwi, cabbage, mushrooms, mangoes, sweet potatoes, watermelon, and carrots. So these are the Dirty Dozen and the Clean 15. Let's go ahead and move on to diet, because this is a very important aspect of this program, and also, again, near and dear to my heart, something that I focus on very heavily with people. So we're going to be looking at some brain-specific nutrients. Our brain is very metabolically active. It needs a lot of nutrients in order to function optimally. We're going to be looking at low sugar, high fiber, anti-inflammatory, plant strong, so mostly plant-based, brain supportive fats, and then eating the right amount for you. So not too much, not too little. There's some research on people who may have gained weight above their personal ideal that might be inflammatory, but that is something that's individual for a lot of people. Some of you may know Michael Pollan. This is one of my favorite quotes. So Michael Pollan is a journalist and a food writer, and he has written many best-selling books like The Omnivore's Dilemma and In Defense of Food. I think he has just such a great way of describing what a healthy eating pattern is, and I like the simplicity of this quote. How many of you have seen this before? So eat food, so referring to real food, not too much, and mostly plants. And I think if we live by that, it's just a simple guideline. It kind of sums up a lot of what we'll be talking about. Okay, another little bit of a ridiculogram here, but I want to go through a few nutrients to think about in order to have a healthy brain. So omega-3 fatty acids, this is one that many people have probably heard about. It's called an essential fatty acid because we are not able to make it in our body, so we need to get it from our diet. And it's something that usually exists in small amounts in most foods, except for salmon or fish, and it's something that can be easily damaged in cooking. And so for this reason, some people might not be getting enough omega-3. It's helpful to reduce inflammation. It helps make cells more responsive to hormones and neurotransmitter signals. And it also supports learning, memory, and mood. So omega-3s are really important. Best sources are going to be fish and seafood. It's great that we live in the Pacific Northwest and it's easily accessible here. But we also find it in flax and chia and hemp seeds, walnuts, and also leafy green vegetables. There's actually a test you can get online. You can just order it online. It's about $50, where you can prick your finger and blot it on some paper, and this lab will tell you the percentage of omega-3s in your red blood cells. And so you want to be about above, 8% would be ideal. And so this, if you're curious, because some people will say, well, I don't know if I'm eating enough fish, or I don't know if I should take fish oil. This might be a way to help you sort of gather data on yourself to see how you're doing. So you could take a supplement, or you could just boost your intake of some of these foods. B vitamins, there are a lot of them, and most of them are really important for brain health. So vitamins are cofactors, which means I think of them as like keys that sort of run the machinery of our bodies, and some of the enzymes and such that help our bodies function at a higher level. And many of them are cofactors for making a molecule called ATP, which is important for energy. Our brains use a lot of energy. And so B vitamins are important for that and for making neurotransmitters and cellular regeneration. So whole grains, nuts and seeds, beans, legumes. When I go through these foods, you are going to see a common pattern, because most of the nutrients I'm going to talk about are found in whole grains, leafy greens, legumes, nuts and seeds. So keep that in mind, because that's a major theme of this talk as well. One of the things we do in our clinic as well is we test people's B12 levels. And even though around 300 or 400 is considered normal, we typically like to see it higher. And that can, like above, like at least 600, that can be associated with greater neurological health. So you could ask to have your B12 levels tested. There are a lot of medications that people take that can deplete that. And in the aging process, you can become less efficient at absorbing B12. So I think that's a really important one to look at if you are interested in supporting brain health. Choline is a compound that is it's a fat-based compound that's a component of cell membranes, and it helps to make our cells more sensitive to neurotransmitters. It's also made into neurotransmitters like acetylcholine, and it supports memory, mood, and brain cell production and nerve production as well. So we find that in egg yolks, soybeans, fish, poultry, wheat germ, beans, and whole grains. Magnesium is another one that is super important. It's a cofactor for neurotransmitters, also for it helps to lower inflammation in the brain, and it lowers dementia and stroke risk. So leafy greens, nuts and seeds. I don't even know if I need to read the foods anymore, because you know what food sources they are, right? But one of the foods that is so high in magnesium, actually 3 tablespoons will meet your whole daily supply, is hemp seeds. How many people have ever eaten hemp seeds? They're the best. Actually, when I was teaching at Bastyr, I actually put on my final exam, if you can correctly recommend hemp seeds or arugula, those are some of my favorite like superfoods, on this test, I will give you extra credit. So, and when I would ask a question in class and people didn't know, they'd go, hemp seeds? So hemp seeds are great. They're also a great source of protein and omega-3s. I mean, what's not to love? So the next one on the list is polyphenols. How many people have heard that term before, polyphenols? So these are a type of phytochemicals. So phytochemicals are compounds that plants make, often to protect themselves, but we can borrow that and they can have really powerfully protective effects in our bodies. So polyphenols are found mostly in purple, red, mostly like purple and red foods is really a great way to think of it. You also find them in dark chocolate. I think I saw some chocolate on the tables here. So getting your polyphenols, red wine, and tea, turmeric, coffee, onions, garlic. I mean, so many different foods, and there's so many different types of polyphenols. But what polyphenols and a lot of these phytonutrients do is when we eat them, they can bind to our cells. And I almost think it sounds like science fiction, but when they bind to our cells, they actually send a signal into the cell to say, hey, I'm here, everything's okay. You don't need to inflame. You don't need to create inflammatory markers. So they calm down inflammation. And then also, a lot of our healthy bacteria like to eat them. And so they actually nurture our microbiome. So we already talked about this brain and gut connection. So if you have a lot of gut issues, polyphenols can sometimes help sort of calm that down. So polyphenol is really important. And then high fiber carbohydrates. So fiber is super important for nourishing the microbiome, and then it helps to stabilize blood sugar, which we'll talk about in just a moment. We also, with these carbohydrates, they're really high in B vitamins, which we already talked about being so important, and magnesium. So whole grains, root vegetables, beans, nuts, seeds, fruits, and vegetables, all high fiber. Blood sugar. If anybody has issues with blood sugar, this is something that can affect your brain long term. So it's really worthwhile to know your numbers and to know what your blood sugar is doing. So glucose is the main source of fuel for your brain. And there's lots of evidence that people who have diabetes or even prediabetes, or some studies even show if you regularly have high blood sugar or spike your blood sugar, and you don't have diabetes, that can still be linked with cognitive decline. And there's a lot of interest in measuring blood sugar now. If you are looking online or in social media, there's a lot of people talking about using glucose meters and things. And both of the major manufacturers of glucose meters are now available over the counter. And actually, this one, and again, I don't work for them, but I just brought an example. This is called a Stelo, Stelo, and it's from Dexcom. Oh, thank you. It's from Dexcom. And it's a continuous glucose meter that you can go and buy online. And what it does is instead of doing a blood draw or a finger stick where you get kind of a snapshot in time, it measures your blood sugar every 5 minutes for 2 weeks. And it gives you data clouds, and it gives you kind of, you can see what happens after you eat. Does your blood sugar spike really high? And if it does, you can try different foods to see if you can bring your blood sugar down, because over time, high exposure to insulin and high blood sugar spikes can cause inflammation, and that can lead to neurological decline. So it comes in this little device. You put it on your arm, and it's painless. It does have a filament in it that goes into your skin, but it will just transmit to your phone. So I work a lot with those, and a lot of people find them really insightful to gather data about how their own body reacts to different foods. If you're a person who can eat bananas, you deserve an applause, because not many people eat a banana and not spike their blood sugar. Bananas are great foods, but we all learn about what our bodies can handle. So healthy blood sugar is really, really important. I recommend, if you don't know your hemoglobin A1C or your 3-month average, that might be another lab besides maybe your omega-3s, your B12, that you look to see what your hemoglobin A1C is. Many people will get their blood sugar tested, so their fasting glucose, and I've seen many times where people have a normal fasting glucose, but their 3-month average is higher than optimal. And we even start working with people on recommending these if their hemoglobin A1C is like, well, we look at the trend. If it was 5.2 and now it's 5.5, we'll say, that's a trend in the wrong direction, even though it's still normal. And someone might say, okay, that's normal. So essentially, the way that we balance blood sugar, high fiber foods, physical activity, healthy fats, and anti-inflammatory dietary patterns. So when you eat glucose, your pancreas makes a hormone called insulin, and that floats through the blood, and it kind of like knocks on the door of the cell and says, hey, I've got some glucose for you. And then these glucose channels will open and the glucose can come in. But if you have something called insulin resistance or prediabetes, what happens is that knock happens on the door, but the door doesn't open. And why doesn't it open? Well, there can be a variety of different reasons, but one of them could be inflammation. So if there's an inflammatory process or even like a low level of inflammation, those doors aren't going to open. Healthy fats can help those doors open. So if you have an adequate amount of omega-3s, that's helpful. If you're physically active, those doors will open even if there's no insulin there. So many times people are wearing these meters and their blood sugar is elevated, they go for a walk and their blood sugar comes down. So you can see it in real time, the impact of that. So these are some of the things that are important about um, balancing out your blood sugar. And again, I do recommend that you ask for your hemoglobin A1C if you haven't had that tested. You can also ask for a fasting insulin. That's a good one to know because we also calculate something called a HOMA-IR, which if it's above 2, it means that you have a probability of risk of insulin resistance. So that's where you take your fasting glucose and your fasting insulin levels, and there's a calculation you can do. So that's just another, way to calculate some data. And we like to be preventive. So we're just looking for some of those numbers before you get to prediabetes. What are the high fiber foods? I shouldn't even have to read this list. What are they? Right? Whole grains. There's something on here you might not have heard of, which we call pseudo grains, which they are technically grains, but they're just a little bit higher in protein. And those will be like quinoa, buckwheat, teff, amaranth, wild rice, legumes and lentils, starchy vegetables, whole fruits, nuts and seeds, and of course, all the veggies. Most people, well, this is the conversation I have a lot with people is, well, I really like sweets and I have a sweet tooth. What can I do? There's got to be something. What can when I'm craving something, what can I eat? And when I think about sweets, I think about the aspect of how um, many refined sweets that we eat are kind of like thieves. They come into our body and they're missing their B vitamins and their magnesium and their fiber. And so they absorb really quickly and they sort of create this crowding effect in our blood where lots of glucose comes into our blood. And then it creates some inflammation because it's like a stress response almost to having that high blood sugar. And then they steal nutrients from us. So they steal our magnesium and they steal our B vitamins in order to metabolize them. So what if we ate sweets that weren't quite such a crowd-inducing situation? Maybe they have a little bit more fiber. And what if they were just really nutrient dense, right? What if they had lots of B vitamins and magnesium and such and other nutrients? So that's what I call sweets that give back. So what's some examples of these? You can take some yogurt, like Greek yogurt, which is really high in protein, which helps to stabilize blood sugar. And you can put some berries and some nuts on top of there. So what do we get from that? With the Greek yogurt, we get probiotics, which help support our microbiome. We also get berries and fruits that have lots of those polyphenols in there, right? Anti-inflammatory, support our gut microbiome, and also nutrient dense. We get lots of B vitamins from the Greek yogurt. And then nuts, anything that you can plant in the ground and it will grow is a powerhouse of nutrients. So whole grains, nuts and seeds, legumes, right? You could plant them and they'll grow into a plant. So nuts and seeds are high in lots of minerals and nutrients and B vitamins and such. So this is an example of a sweet that gives back, really easy to make. This is one of my favorites. If I'm craving something sweet, I'll often grab a date. I like to keep my dates in the refrigerator because I like them to be firm. And so I put a little bit of almond butter or peanut butter in there and it's delicious. So high fiber. Many people can eat dates if you have 2 or 3 dates, and it doesn't tend to spike blood sugar a lot for many people. If you add the nut butter, you're adding all those vitamins and minerals and the healthy fats, which help to kind of slow things down too. So dates with nut butter. And then another thing that sometimes I'll do when I'm craving sweets is I'll toast some pecans or nuts in a skillet and then put a little bit of maple syrup on there. And it's a high fiber, high protein, lots of nutrients. And then the maple syrup also has some magnesium and other nutrients, right? So these are sweets that when we eat them, it's like going to a potluck and bringing food versus going to a potluck and just eating, right? So that's kind of the analogy with sweets that give back. So you could put some herbs and spices on here. We haven't talked about that yet, but herbs and spices are another way to get those phytochemicals that calm down inflammation. So you can make food fun and delicious without, and also be supportive. Let's talk just a little bit more about fats. the types of fats that you eat in your diet make a really big difference for inflammation in your body and also in your brain. So the fats that increase inflammation, probably most of you know this already, but foods that are deep fried, foods that are hydrogenated, foods that are highly processed. So eating ultra processed foods, many times the fats are damaged. And then having a, I'm only pausing a little bit because there are some genetic differences here. Most people don't know how their body handles saturated fats, but there's a significant number of people that when they eat a high level of saturated fats and also when you're thinking about saturated fats, it's sometimes abstract because you don't just eat saturated fat. It's really more tied to a dietary pattern, right? So if you're eating a lot of animal proteins and red meats and cream and butter and cheese and those types of foods that are high in the type of fat, um, for many people, it does increase inflammation, and it can also make those glucose channels a little bit harder to open. So, um, having more olive oil, avocados, avocado oil, nuts and seeds, fish, those are going to have more of these like slippery fats that help those glucose stores open. And that when they get incorporated into your cells and your brain cells, they help them become more sensitive to neurotransmitters and other hormones like insulin. Few recipes here. Um, this is a take on like a peanut sauce, like a Thai peanut sauce, where you can use almond butter, but you could use peanut butter. And so you add a little bit of rice vinegar, a little bit of maple syrup, some ginger and garlic, some hot pepper oil. Nowadays, you can find those chili oils that have like chili and other seeds and things in them. I don't know if you've seen those before, but adding a little bit of that in there just gives it some texture too, and it's a nice spice. If you do not like spice, you don't have to add that. And then a little bit of water. It's so easy to make. It comes together very quickly, and it's delicious on grains, vegetables, proteins, and so peanut sauce is really delicious, or almond butter sauce. This is a 5-minute avocado green goddess dressing. So you can make a salad dressing using avocado. Just put it in the blender, some garlic, some lemon, olive oil, warm water, coarse salt, herbs, and you can just mix that up and it can last for like 4 or 5 days in the fridge. So a great way to add those neuroprotective fats. And then eating more fish. There's a variety of ways to eat fish. So fish tacos are a great way to do that. You can get panko, you can get gluten-free panko, you can get whole grain panko. So panko are like Japanese breadcrumbs, and it makes when you coat those on the fish, you can bake it or put it in an air fryer, and it helps keep the moisture in the fish. It's really delicious. Ceviche is great, which is fish that's cooked using lemon juice. And then I have a recipe here for fish soup as well. So lots and lots of different ways that you can cook fish. And there are a bunch of links here that I've listed. Inflammation is something that we've been alluding to this whole time as being problematic for the brain. And there are some labs that you can request to see what your inflammatory markers are. And one of them is an HSCRP. So many of the people that we see with Parkinson's have really high CRP levels. And we do see for many people when they make dietary changes and they bring in more of those polyphenols and more of those plant-based foods, that number comes down. We also look at the impact of omega-3s. Once they optimize their omega-3 status, that also helps to bring down this inflammatory marker. So this is one that you could ask to look at. Another one that's an inflammatory marker, or two others that are inflammatory markers, are homocysteine. High levels of homocysteine, if your level is above 10, that is linked with a greater risk of dementia. And also high ferritin levels, which is a storage form of iron. A high ferritin level can also be linked with inflammation as well. So those are some of the markers that we tend to look at. And there's also a genetic marker called ApoE, especially the ApoE4 gene is also more associated with Alzheimer's and cognitive decline. And so if you are able to get this tested, it'll give you an idea of your risk. And when we think about those toggle switches, like that comes up frequently, which is bargaining, where people say, well, how much can I really eat? Or what if I have this? I have somebody who almost every week sends me labels of what he's eating, and he always wants me to tell him, how many times a week can I eat this? And I told him, I can't tell you. It's dependent on so many things. And finally, he's sent me so many messages. Every time he sends it to me, I just say twice, 3 times, because it does depend on all the toggle switches and also what's going on biochemically too. And so if you know some of this about yourself, right? Like if you have the ApoE4 gene, I would say maybe once a week you would eat some of those things that might be more like red meats or things like that. So I think it's useful to know some of this data, and inflammation, and especially neuroinflammation is something that is damaging to the brain. This is a study that looks at that brain-gut connection again and talks about how the aggregation in this particular circumstance has to do with Parkinson's. This aggregation of this protein, alpha-synuclein. We can also see examples where it's beta amyloid or other proteins that if there is damaged microbiome, or there's a greater amount of this alpha-synuclein, that it can actually travel to the brain and cause neuroinflammation. So that brain-gut connection is also really important to remember, again, for healthy brain. I asked ChatGPT to create an image of inflammation imbalance, and this is what it gave me, and I absolutely love it because it's a beautiful landscape, but we also see the fire in multiple places, but it's not like a forest fire where it's destroying the environment. It is a fire that's imbalanced, and it's almost beautiful. So inflammation is an important part of our immune system, and it's essential. However, we don't want it to be destructive. And so how do we keep that inflammation in a beautiful place where it protects us and not in a damaging and destructive place? So more plants. We know that more of those plants, those phytochemicals, the more we take them in. Remember, a lot of those phytonutrients, phytochemicals from plants, we find those in the colors, the flavors, the aromas of plant-based foods, and also the fibers. So brightly colored fruits and vegetables, really pungent herbs and spices. Like I think of anything that would stain your clothing, right? Like cherries or blueberries, right? Those are really high in these phytochemicals that are super protective. And when we eat them, they do so many things in our body to help calm down inflammation. And one of them is that they actually bind to our cells and send signals through our cells that tell them, like there are, nuclear factors like NF-kappa beta and others, that they will actually calm those systems down when we eat them. So more herbs and spices, more plants, being careful of your fats, watching your sugar, right? Higher sugar levels can increase inflammation, especially if you have insulin resistance or prediabetes. Reducing toxic exposures, getting good sleep, laughing, staying physically active. Does this sound familiar? We've been talking about this the whole time, and these are things that help bring down inflammation. I know this is a little bit small, but you have copies of this. You can also find it online. It's a phytonutrient spectrum from the Institute for Functional Medicine. I like to give this to people because it just reminds you of all of the options from the color spectrum of phytochemicals that you can eat. And it kind of, can be an inspiration if you might not be eating certain foods. I also recommend a lot when people say, oh, well, the middle of the day is busy, or I'm not really sure what to have for dinner. Maybe they haven't prepared something. I recommend what I call crudité style meals, but not in the way that it would be like charcuterie or, like the red meat, the prosciutto and cheese and that kind of thing necessarily, but more like a plant-based type of crudité meal. And I also heard a new term for it, which is called picky plate. I like that too. It's a picky plate. So you just have a few different things that you can pick at on your plate. And so you could have a picky plate where you say, okay, I'm going to grab some nuts and seeds. I have, an avocado. So I'm just going to put half an avocado. I might squeeze some lime juice on that. I've got some berries. So I'm going to put that on my plate. I've got some whole grain crackers, or maybe I have some leftover potatoes. I might have hummus or edamame, the green soybeans, maybe a few olives or pickles, which give you that fermented aspect for your microbiome. And so you can kind of create a plate. You could also put, I forgot to put egg on here. Egg would be a good one for protein because you get that choline. That's so great. So that's the idea of a picky plate. And you can get so many of those beneficial phytochemicals, healthy fats, all those nutrients that are important for brain health. More nuts and seeds. I often recommend that people ask themselves for every meal, what nut or seed can I eat with this meal? And I bet you can come up with a way that you can sprinkle those on most of the things you eat, whether it's a salad or whether it's grains or whether it's like a stir fry. So think about ways that you can add more nuts and seeds because there are so many studies that show that when people eat more nuts and seeds, they have lower cholesterol, they have less heart disease, they have healthier brains. Nuts and seeds are really powerhouses. Um, this is a recipe for a walnut taco meat where you can actually use walnuts in place of ground beef. So talk about, especially if you spice this with taco seasoning, most people, well, sometimes my family accuses me of being a little less sensitive to like what they call freaky foods. So my family tolerates things like that pretty well because they're used to it. But I think this would have a texture kind of similar to ground beef. And you've got mushrooms, which are high in fiber and B vitamins, and they also have other things like phytonutrients like beta glucans, which are great for cholesterol and the immune system. You've got walnuts that are really high in omega-3s and fiber, right? So you can just start listing off all of the beneficial effects that these foods have. And they're delicious and in addition to, being supportive, especially for your brain. Herbs and spices, I'm always encouraging people to get more. And, if something calls for 1 clove of garlic, if you're making it, put 3. Um, if you have, like a dash of this or a dash of that, put more. A lot of times for cooking, that's okay. If it's baking, you might have to be careful. But, when it comes to spices, the more is typically better. I have a friend who is from Ethiopia, and she makes this dish that in the crock pot where she puts lentils in there, but she has about maybe 6 or 8 onions that she grinds up in the food processor, a bunch of turmeric, a bunch of ginger, a bunch of garlic, and tomatoes, and a whole bunch of spices. And she just cooks it all day. And it is so incredible. But think about all of those phytonutrients that you get from that. I have another friend who's from India. She has a cooking outfit. She puts her hair in a shower cap because she uses so many spices. She doesn't want her hair to smell like that. And so think about that when you're cooking, if you're just like a dash of salt and a dash of pepper, what else can you add to that? Because the more herbs and spices, the more protection, the more phytonutrients that you get, the more anti-inflammatory aspects. So this is a list you can refer to. There's so many great options. I did put World Spice Merchants, which they're in the Pike Place Market and they do mail delivery, and they have the most incredible herbs and spice mixes. You can sort of travel around the world and gather all of these different amazing flavors that you can add to your foods. If you've never been there, they're on Western. It's an amazing experience, and a lot of local restaurants buy their spices from them. Here's another take on some like the nut recipe that I gave you earlier, where you can do spice nuts. So adding lots of herbs and spices to nuts. So you've got all those nutrients and anti-inflammatory components. Matcha is a Japanese green tea powder, which is stronger than green tea because you're eating the whole leaf or you're consuming the whole leaf. It's incredibly anti-inflammatory and very, very high in polyphenols. Be aware it does have quite a bit of caffeine, so I might not drink it at night. But it is really powerful. I often will put matcha powder in smoothies. You can mix it into yogurt or other beverages. So it's a great addition. And then turmeric. So turmeric has lots and lots of research behind it. It's anti-inflammatory. It's neuroprotective. There are products like golden milk or teas if you don't eat turmeric regularly, or just using curry powder. You can add it to your eggs, to rice, sauteed vegetables, smoothies, soups. You can add it to a lot of different foods. I think I saw some comment about oxalate content. It is true if you have kidney stones. if you're eating lots of whole turmeric, it is high in oxalate. Some people take a turmeric supplement, which if you take curcumin, which is a compound, it's the orange compound in turmeric, typically doesn't have oxalate. But turmeric overall is incredible. And then eating more beans. So just like nuts, I'm always encouraging people to eat more beans. So how can you add more beans to your diet? Lots and lots of soup. You can roast chickpeas and put spices on them if you want to put those in the oven, or cook them first. So they're first cooked so they're soft, but then you can put a little olive oil and salt and spices and roast them. And they're kind of a nice alternative to you could even use them as croutons in a salad. Add beans and lentils to your salad, vegetables and pasta. I like to add beans to pasta, gives extra fiber and nutrients. Also a side dish. And there's this great website called the Bean Institute, where they have thousands of recipes for beans. This is a great recipe, Power Bowl recipe, where you can sort of build a meal based off of a variety of different, food groups. So whole grains, beans, nuts and seeds, vegetables, and then, just keep some dressings on hand to give it a little flavor. Here's a kale salad with cashew dressing and chickpea croutons. So if raw kale is a little intense, getting the baby kale is a little easier. You can also massage the dressing into it and it gets a lot softer, but you can use those roasted chickpeas kind of like you would put, kind of like croutons, like I said. The last few slides are about dietary patterns. And so if we were going to sum up all of these recommendations and think, okay, so I've got it, we need to eat, more plant-based, we need to have more, omega-3s, we need more B vitamins and magnesium and fiber. And, how do we pull it all together? One of the best studied diets is the Mediterranean diet, or also the MIND diet, which is a combination of a DASH diet for hypertension and a Mediterranean diet. And these two diets are actually very, very similar. So they are both mostly plant-based, meaning more plants than animal products. The biggest difference between Mediterranean and MIND is that the MIND diet has more berries and more leafy greens. And this is a dietary pattern that's not just exclusive to Mediterranean regions. It has been applied also to different dietary patterns around the world. So I like to make sure that if you're following a Mediterranean pattern, that you know that it doesn't have to be, hummus and pita, but it can be foods from Latin America. It can be foods from Africa, Asia. It can be, vegetarian. So it can be a variety of different dietary patterns if we're looking at time-honored ways of eating and reduction in ultra-processed foods and eating more plants. This is something that it's called a Mediterranean diet scoring tool. And so this might be a little bit hard to read, but you all have copies of it. And this is often used in research to look at how are people's diets conforming to this Mediterranean pattern. And when we look at what the different aspects are, number one is, are you eating olive oil? And if you're going to be conforming to this dietary pattern, where there are multiple studies showing that Mediterranean style eating, eating in a Mediterranean pattern helps with dementia, mood, cardiovascular, immune, metabolic, a variety of different health conditions. It includes olive oil, but also 4 tablespoons a day of olive oil is what's recommended if you're following this. So I'm helping out with a study right now through the Department of Surgery, where we're helping people to eat in this way. And that's one of the top questions I get is, how do you eat 4 tablespoons of olive oil every day? And there are lots of creative ways that you can get that in, just using a little bit more when you cook, getting a good one and using it as a finishing oil. If you have a whole grain bread, dipping your bread in that instead of using butter. So there's lots of ways that you can do that, making your own salad dressings out of olive oil. So olive oil is a really important part of it. How many servings of vegetables do you eat per day? So you want to eat at least 2 servings, which I think is low, but that's That's part of the scoring tool. How many servings of fruit? So at least 5 servings of fruits and vegetables per day. And then minimizing red meat, butter and cream, sweets, and then increasing legumes, fish, nuts and seeds, and also eating more like tomato-based products. So they include something called sofrito, which is like it can be made in different ways around the world, but it's typically tomato and olive oil based condiment. So you could actually take this and figure out what your score is and try to boost it. The higher, the better. 14 is a perfect top score. The other thing we can take a look at is a couple other dietary patterns. And people ask a lot about these dietary patterns. And I would say for most of them, the ones that I'm talking about here, they do need more research and they can, in some ways, impart risk. So I do think it's important to work with a healthcare provider or a dietitian if you're planning to do this. One of them is calorie restriction. So there are some studies looking at eating about 15 to 30% less than what your caloric needs are. In animal studies, it seems really clear that it helps to promote longevity and greater health. But in human studies, it's not quite as clear. There does seem to be some benefit to working memory and processing speed, but it can cause weight loss and malnutrition. So I think it's important to work with a healthcare provider on that. Um, Intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating is probably the most common dietary pattern that I help people with. And I think that there are many ways that this can be very, very healthy. And so what that means is that you're eating within a specific window each day. So you might be fasting for 12 to 18 hours in a 24-hour period. So that might be where maybe you stop eating at, 8 p.m. and then you don't eat again until like 10 a.m. Or maybe you stop eating at 6 and then you eat again at 8 a.m. So it's not something super drastic for most people, but the longer that you have a fasting period, the lower your fasting insulin is, which helps to protect against some of those high blood sugar situations that can be harmful for the brain. So some people take it to a level where they might just eat in a 4 or 6 hour window. And I think that's where you're running into problems. So definitely work with a healthcare provider or a dietitian if you want to do something like this, especially if you're thinking of extending it to a longer time frame. And then ketogenic diets are also popular. And there are, some studies that show, especially with Alzheimer's and people who have the ApoE4 variant, that maybe a higher fat diet might be helpful. But I think you have to be careful about it. And certainly looking at more of those plant-based fats versus eating a lot of like animal fats. And so there can be some nutrient deficiencies, and some people, just like I was saying before, where some people genetically can eat more saturated fats and it doesn't seem to increase risk. But there are a significant number of people that if they're really increasing their fats, it can increase their cardiovascular risk factors. And we know that can also increase risk of stroke and such. So just be careful if you're wanting to do something like this. And I would say, just as a dietitian who works with these diets, most people can't stick with them. I mean, imagine eating 60 to 80% of your diet as fat. Most people are like, I don't even know what that looks like. So it can be challenging, socially, long-term and such. But some people are, eat it and have, good effects. But I would just be careful and make sure that it's the right diet for you and get your lipids checked. Okay. That was a lot, I know, but I'm going to sum it up here with a checklist again and thinking of those toggle switches. So lifestyle, 30 minutes of activity daily, 150 minutes a week. Focus, I know that those don't add up, but I'm just saying at least 150 minutes, but 30 minutes a day is ideal. Focus on restorative sleep, have some social interaction, reduce your exposure to chemicals, and then eating lots of fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, legumes, fish. Can you get 3 or 4 tablespoons a day of olive oil, a good olive oil, low sugar, high fiber, and using lots of herbs and spices? So if you're focusing on raising these toggle switches, you will be eating and living in a way that will optimize your brain. And these are a few resources for you for some of the recipes for Mediterranean mind diet and such, and plant-based diets. Thank you so much.